Good afternoon, and welcome back to another edition of the B&H Virtual Event Space. You are tuned into Sony at Night, taking and making compelling night images with Mahesh Thapa. Mahesh, how's it going, man?
It's great. Great. It's great to be here for the holidays. Always a pleasure seeing you and the gang. It's
It's
like a
always
little
great.
treat.
It's always good having you on. We get in the green room, we get the vibes going early, and it just kind of rolls right in. So it's always good to have you in. Of course, it's always a pleasure to have a Sony hosted event. We want to thank Sony for hosting this event as they do all the events you've seen here with Mahesh. And if you haven't seen Mahesh on our channel here, you haven't been watching because he's all over the place, but definitely check out our channel. We'll drop a link to where you can see all of our archived content in case you guys are not up on that. But Mahesh, I'm going to let you do the talking here, and I'm going to turn it over to you. I'm going to invite everybody to get all your questions in over the next hour as Mahesh will be answering them. But take it away, Mahesh.
Yes, thank you. I'm going to start sharing my screen here. And I'm going to do this, typical of me. It's going to be some talking head, some demonstration, and I just want to make sure I'm sharing the right screen here. I think it's this one. Okay, hopefully you can see it like a Adobe Lightroom Classic. Yeah.
Yep.
Right. Okay, perfect. It's what I've done is I've created a couple of short videos, sort of illustrating some of the points I want to make. And I'm going to start out with this one. And I'm doing this one because the screen shot that you saw initially, where you had that sort of red sky and the Seattle skyline with the lit up buildings, it was a technique I used that I'm going to explain here. And I think it's gotten good feedback. Even Derek is like, "Hey, did you really take that shot?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I did take that shot." And we were still talking about that. And I think it's a concept that's been around for a very, very long time. Even in the film days, they use this idea, and then we've just adapted it to the digital world. So it's the concept of how do you get that shot of the skyline, night skyline, where you got this beautiful, colorful sunset sky, yet the building lights are still prominent and they've turned on, right? Because typically sunset happens before the building lights come on. It's often two different times that you're doing this, often half an hour, 45 minutes apart, yet it creates a much more compelling image, I think, than one of the image alone. Maybe you just have a great sunset shot, but the buildings are sort of silhouetted out. It just has a bland gray appearance. Or you get this great shot of the skyline with these beautiful building lights and dramatic artificial lights from elsewhere. Yet you've sort of gone to the blue hour where the sky is sort of a bland blue. Wouldn't it be great if we could sort of combine the two relatively easy and create this sort of compelling looking shot? And that's sort of what that first screenshot showed, a skyline and the red sky. And in the film days, what they used to do was they used to set up the tripod, take a picture exposed for the sunset sky. So they got this beautiful shot because the sunset is so much brighter than the foreground. So the foreground and the building lights used to be sort of dark, almost silhouetted. You still have a little shadow detail, but the exposure was sort of geared towards, or you're cheating towards, getting a nice, beautiful, well-lit, bright sky. Now, you wait half hour, 45 minutes, and then you don't advance the film, right? That's the trick. You don't advance the film and you take another shot while the building lights have come on, traffic lights are there. And so what gets brighter? So the sky's not going to get brighter because it's already as bright as it can be. It's not going to get replaced by a darker blue sky. What's going to get brighter are the building lights. So you've got these outline of building lights and the lights have sort of come on and you got this great combination. So I started doing this 15, 20 years ago, and people didn't know about that technique, but I sort of had learned it from the film days, and I just sort of applied it to digital photography. So I'm going to share with you exactly how I do it. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to write them down, ask them. It's actually not that complex, but it does require a little bit of technical knowledge and how to prepare for the shot. So let me show you this video, and hopefully this shows well. I'm gonna share it again now with this type optimized for video. Share sound, optimized for video. Okay, that's good. So I'm going to start this. Hi there, this is Mahesh Thapa, the starting photographer,
Mahesh, we're not seeing, we're still seeing, we're just seeing that you've started screen sharing. If you could just
Got it.
pull down, yeah, sometimes it gets hung up. If you could just pull down the shared screen and try it again.
I want to show you how to quickly.
Did that work or no?
This time I was hearing it, but not seeing it.
Okay, let me stop share again and share it one more time.
And easily
There we
combine
go.
a sunset
Yep, looks good.
Good, awesome.
sky with an image taken later on during the evening when the building lights have come on. So basically a sunset sky with a nighttime look of the buildings. We are in a Lightroom right now, and I have two images for you to look at. The first image is basically around sunset, and you can see a nice colorful sky. I'll double click on that. But the buildings aren't very interesting in the sense that the lights have just begun to come on the Hotel Paris, the building itself, and the pseudo Eiffel Tower. However, now if we look at the image slightly later on, the buildings look gorgeous, and you've got this water show coming up from the Bellagio Hotel. The water is well lit, but the sky is sort of a bland blue. So wouldn't it be nice if we could quickly and easily combine the sky from the first image with the sky from the second image? And this tutorial is going to show you how to do it relatively easily in Photoshop. So let's just go over some of the parameters that I have on these images. So the very first part, this was taken around 5:30 p.m. On the 27th of February. I took this on a Sony a7R III using the 16-35 G Master f2.8 lens. If we look at the parameters, I shot the lens at its optimum aperture, which is about f8. I did have a neutral density filter there to average out the ripples in the water and make it look a little smooth. And so the ND filter, I think it was a 5-stop or 8-stop ND filter in front of the lens, such that the exposure time is now 5 seconds. And this is sort of important if you have water in your picture or if you have reflections, because you want the exposure time to be in the same order of magnitude on both images. Because if you have a water that's very choppy in one image and a water that's relatively smooth in the other, the blend tends to look a little funny. So this is one thing I've learned. And when I say the same order of magnitude, I mean it could be 2 seconds and 5 seconds, things like that. Don't have it 1/1000th of a second or 1/200th of a second on one exposure, and then 2 seconds or 20 seconds or 50 seconds on the second exposure, because the blending of the ripples becomes a little problematic. So that's one sort of pro tip I want to convey to you guys to begin with. So those are the parameters of the first image, the sunset image, and this is the parameters of the second image once the building lights have come on. So this was taken at 5:58, so let's see, about 25 minutes or so after the first image. And again, the exposure time is a little less, even though it's darker, at 1.6 seconds, but it's in the ballpark of the 5 seconds of exposure that was in the first image. And if we look at the water pattern, it's relatively similar, so the blend is not going to be that harsh or unrealistic looking. And again, shot this at the same aperture. You want to try to keep the same aperture because you want to minimize the effect of magnification that can happen with differences in aperture values. But with a 16-35 lens, I think I shot this at 35 millimeters, both images, of course. It's not going to be that big of a deal, but so if you have to change the aperture a little bit one way or the other, not going to make a big difference on ultra wide angle lens. The longer the focal length, the more careful you want to be at keeping that aperture value around the same number, just so you want to minimize the magnification that can happen. So again, this was taken with a Sony a7R III, so the resolution is great. And of course, I used a very high quality, the G Master 16-35 millimeter lens at f8 and 35 millimeters. This is going to take a quick zoomed up view. This is at 100%. You can tell everything's very, very sharp, very clean looking. So I mean, there really is a great looking file, both for the sunset image, which I'm showing you here, and the previous image where we showed you what it looked like post sunset. Okay, so let's go back to our grid view. Also, let's talk about the shooting conditions and the equipment. Besides a high quality lens and camera, you want to make sure you have a sturdy tripod. And basically, you're keeping the tripod in the same position over this extended period of time because you want to make sure there's no misregistration or alignment issues later on, which does mean that you're basically sacrificing yourself or your equipment to that one particular composition. So find your composition and stick to it because you can't move your tripod, you can't change your settings, you just have to take it as best you can from that position that you're at because you want to have perfect alignment. And as we go from one image to the other, you see that indeed there is great alignment in these two images. So with that being said, let's go up to Photoshop, and what I typically do is I select both images, this one here, and command click on the Mac, and I'm going to right click or two-finger click and say edit in and open as layers in Photoshop. And here it is coming up. And here is the blue hour image, and so on top of this the sunset image will show up, and you see it on the right hand side. We have two layers, first the sunset layer and then the blue layer. So if I toggle the eye icon here, you can see that there's good registration, not very much movement. That being said, I always run the auto align layer algorithm to the layers and the images to make sure that there's no misregistration whatsoever. So I'm going to select the first layer is already selected, and I'm going to command click the second layer, showing that both layers are now selected, and I'm going to go to edit. Down here that says auto align layers, and typically I just choose the auto function. That seems to work pretty well for these types of images, so I'm going to hit OK. So the program looks for edges and similarities and aligns the two images as best it can, and it usually does a very, very good job. So if you can notice, I'm going to zoom up to 100%. Here at the edges, you could tell that some misregistration was present, but it has been adjusted. So now let's see how this looks with and without the top layer. And so it looks like we've got perfect adjustments. Now let's go back, zoom out. So now it's as simple as just changing the blending mode from normal to this thing that says lighten. And so what it does is the program looks at pixel per pixel over the two layers that you've selected, and it shows you just the brightest pixel from those two pixels. Or it could be, how many of the layers you have. It just shows the very, very brightest of the layers at that particular level. So the theory is, in the sky, it's very dark in the blue hour. The sunset sky is much brighter, so that's going to actually show through. But in the buildings, the building lights that have come on after sunset are much brighter, so that pixel is going to overpower the darker pixels of the sunset image. So you have a nice combination of both the sunset sky and the building lights. And let's look at this at 100% to see how good it is at the edges, and that's what we really care about, because you want to have good registration. You want to make sure that the edges look clean. So I'm going to go to 100%. The sunset building has been replaced beautifully by the night sky image. The edges look great, very, very clean. And even the Eiffel Tower itself looks really, really clean. And I think it has done a wonderful job. Now, if you still think the image is overall too bright, which I do a little bit, as a final step, I just adjust the contrast with curves. So I'm going to create a new layer, new adjustment layer, and I'm going to say curves. And here, I'm going to call it curves 1, that's fine. Okay, here I'm going to make it a little bigger so I can work with the curves. So now I'm going to make a contrast curve, basically, increasing the brightness and decreasing the shadows. And if I've crushed the shadows a little too much, I can bring it up a little more from down here. That's pretty good, and I can decrease the extreme highlights just a little bit. Okay, and in a few easy steps, really it's taking me longer to explain it than to actually do it. we've got a very, very good looking image where we have the sunset sky, a brilliant sunset sky, and the gorgeous nighttime buildings. So let's just look at how this is. And I'm going to come down here, make this a little bigger. So original blue hour image here. Let's go make it just like so. Sunset sky put in with the light and blending layer, and an overall slight adjustment, if you will, to the curves to give you this slightly more contrasty image, if you will. And there you go. A simple way of blending.
Yeah, so this is, I think, a very, very powerful technique to create these compelling evening shots where you have a sunset sky and you have this great, and this works for many situations. This is just one example that I used. Let's say you wanted to capture streaks of light on traffic. One option is to just expose for a very long time and try to get as many light streaks as you possibly can in the traffic. In fact, let me show you exactly what I'm talking about. I have my website here. Oh, by the way, if you want to know exactly how to do this and you couldn't follow the video, I've actually outlined a step-by-step process on Alpha Universe, and I think our B&H team is going to be sharing that link with you just to give you an idea of how it's done. But let me just go to my website here so you can see this. So here's another example of the similar technique, for example, over here. So what I've done is I've taken a sunset shot. I've done the nighttime building images. In addition, I've taken several nighttime building images because each time the streaks of light on the traffic are being built up. So it looks like this is heavily trafficked, lots of red and white streaks, but this is probably a combination of 20 images that are blended using the lighten technique. So every time you apply that lighten technique to a layer, more and more lights get sort of added on in that area, because any part of the freeway that was dark gets replaced by the brighter layer of the traffic lights. And if there's already traffic lights there for the previous layer, that doesn't get replaced. So it's really a great technique to get these cityscape types of shots. So hopefully that has helped you out a little bit. Again, if you have any questions, put them in the comment section. Okay, so that's one thing that I wanted to really focus on. The second is, well, it's that time of year, right? It's late December. We've got New Year's coming up, and we love to photograph fireworks. So there are several ways we can photograph fireworks. The technique I like to use is a technique that also sort of originated in the film days. And so as you can sort of see a theme here. And I've adapted it to how we do it in the digital age. So sure, what you can do is you can take multiple shots, firework shots, and again, use this lightning blending mode to create all these different fireworks at various times in the sky. But there's a more elegant, I think, technique that you can try out in a few weeks, where you put a black card in front of your lens, and then you expose the image every so often. And let me show you a little video that shows exactly what to do, and we can talk about it a little bit more. So let me share with you that video. I'm going to stop. I'm going to reshare. Let's start from here.
Capture several bursts on a single exposure. Yes, you can use Photoshop to simulate the effect, but I thought it would be nice to show you how we can apply an old school technique to modern fireworks photography. When you get on location, compose your shot and determine the proper exposure for the scene. I recommend initially shooting in aperture priority mode, as you see over here, the A. Decide on a reasonable aperture value such as f8 at ISO 100 and see what the camera determines the shutter speed should be. For example, in our case, the ISO is set to 100, the aperture is set to f8, and the camera has determined the shutter speed should be 10 seconds to get the proper exposure for the scene. Take a few test shots with your camera and make sure you're happy with the overall exposure. Now keep these parameters in mind before going to the next step. Now switch over to full manual setting on your camera, and you do this by going over to the manual setting. Dial in the ISO and aperture values we determined on the prior test shooting. So in our case, it was f8 and ISO 100. We are already at the bulb setting. This is where you should be. If you're not at the bulb setting, you may have to play around with your shutter speed values that you see over here until it gets to a value that says not 30 seconds, but bulb, okay? Bulb mode allows you to control exactly how long the shutter stays open. Pressing the shutter button opens the shutter once, and it will stay open until you press the shutter button again. That's what the bulb mode allows you to do. When the fireworks begin, press the shutter button immediately, and then place the black card in front of the lens. At this point, no light is hitting the sensor. When you see an interesting burst, let the card down and expose the sensor. Then place the black card back in front of the lens. Typically, this will expose the sensor for about 2 seconds. Keep repeating the process like this, removing and replacing the black card until the predetermined exposure time you established during the test shooting is reached. In my case, the predetermined time was 10 seconds, so I'll be able to drop the black card 5 times, assuming that with each drop, the card exposes the sensor for about 2 seconds. That is, 5 times 2 seconds equals 10 seconds, the optimal exposure time for the scene. This will allow you to get the well-lit scene while capturing multiple bursts of fireworks. Thanks again.
Yeah, so I think it's important to get the concept right. You have to take a test shot just to get the proper exposure of the scene to begin with. So for example, for the Space Needle shot, I set my ISO to 100, aperture f8, and then I took a shot that would expose the Space Needle and the surroundings just perfectly. And that happened to be 10 seconds, okay? So, and then now switch the parameters over to the bulb mode, knowing that I cannot have the sensor exposed for more than 10 seconds, because if I have it exposed for more than 10 seconds, the Space Needle will get blown out. It'll look too bright. But keeping a black card in front of the lens inhibits light from hitting the sensor, so you don't have to count that as exposure time. I mean, you could have the shutter down on bulb for 2 minutes as long as the black card is in front of that lens. That's your sensor is not getting exposed. Only when you let the black card down, that light is now, the photons are now coming onto the sensor and you're getting some exposure. So what you have to mentally do is think about, okay, about how many times can I do that technique where I can let the black card down, and you add those values up, and if that value ends up to be 10 seconds, that's when you stop the exposure and you look at your image. And this works remarkably well in sort of this digital era. And this is exactly what they used to do in the film area. So that's another thing. So try it out if you can this holiday season, New Year's time. I'm going to do it. I have this place picked out where I can go and get some shots of the Space Needle in Seattle. But wherever you are, try it out, and I'd love to see what you guys come up with. Because I think it's a really elegant and compelling technique. All right, good. So let's move on to technique number 3 for night photography. Okay, so let me get to my list here. What else do we have? I love this topic. So high ISO blending. Back in the day, Sony had this setting on their point and shoot cameras where it took a burst of images, and then all of a sudden it combined those images, and you got this beautiful, clean looking images. And then what it used to do was, it was assuming that you didn't have a tripod, so you took a bunch of high shutter speed images, but at very high ISO. And then because you did it as a burst, it just auto-aligned everything in camera, and then it blended it so that now the final resulting image was very noise-free. Well, we can apply that technique now. We don't have to, go back to yesteryears and figure out what they did. It's actually very simple to do, and I really like using this, particularly for small sensor cameras or situations where I don't have a tripod with me, yet I still want to capture some nice looking nighttime images. I don't want to have to resort to bumping up the ISO to 1600, 2000, 3000 and get a very noisy image of a nighttime. It just doesn't appeal to me very well. So I think if you think about this process, if you practice it, it'll be another great tool in your sort of armamentarium of tools to use when you get out there and shoot nighttime shots. So I'm going to share this with you. It's called high ISO blending. And I want to give a shout out to Reza, who has helped me create these videos in the past. And a lot of the content I'm sharing with you, he helped me film. So I want to give a shout out to him. Let me start here.
Good evening, folks. Mahesh here again with Reza behind the camera. Welcome to another educational photography session. Tell me if this has happened to you before. You come across this beautiful evening scene, such as this, Seattle downtown. You take out your camera and take a picture, only to realize later that the photo is completely ruined by excessive noise because you shot in automatic mode and the camera chose an insanely high ISO value. Or let's say you decided to combat the high ISO noise by manually setting the ISO to a lower value. Well, chances are that for reasonable apertures, such as f2.8, f4, whatever, you will need a tripod to avoid blurry images. And of course, you've left your tripod behind, right? Well, what to do? Stick around and I'll tell you exactly what I would do to combat that situation. Today, I brought the lovely Sony RX100 Mark VI with me. If available, make sure your image stabilization or steady shot is set to on. Also, I've set the shutter frequency to burst. As you can see from these settings, I'm shooting in program or auto mode, and the camera has chosen the following parameters: an aperture of f2.8, a shutter speed of around 1/30th of a second, and the ISO is set at very high value of 2000. Take a few seconds to take some test shots and make sure your images are not blurry. If they are blurry, you may need to bump up the ISO even higher. Basically, I'll be taking a burst of images at very high ISO values and very fast shutter speeds, and later combining them in Photoshop using the median blending mode. It's not a new technique, but one that's worth revisiting, as not everyone will be familiar with it. And as my high school teacher used to tell me, repetition is the mother of all knowledge. Now I'm going to set the camera on the tripod and manually change the ISO setting such that it is at the minimum native value of 125. We'll compare this image with the one generated from combining the multiple high ISO images and see how they stack up. Haha, a little Photoshop pun for you guys. Without getting too technical, here's a quick explanation of how this method works. The amount of signal generated in each pixel from the scene is relatively constant. However, the noise generated from the high ISO is completely arbitrary and distributed randomly onto the pixels with each shot. By stacking the images and choosing the middle or median, not the average or mean value for each pixel, you are choosing the pixel with the true value and not values spuriously increased or decreased by random noise. If this sounds a little complicated or it's confusing, don't worry, because the proof is in the pudding, and we'll show you what this looks like when we get back to our home and process the images.
Okay, so now we are here in Lightroom, and I'm showing you just the relevant images that demonstrate the editing process. The first 8 images from here to here were shot in burst mode at ISO 2000, shutter speed of 1/30th of a second, and an aperture of f2.8. For comparison purposes, here's the shot taken on the tripod, shot at ISO 125, f2.8, and half a second. So let's just look at these two images a little closely. I'm going to show you this at 100%. This is the 2000 ISO, and you can see a lot of noise, especially in the sky. You can see the plane has been nicely frozen because it's 1/30th of a second. And here it is at ISO 125, a much cleaner file. Look how beautiful the sky is, virtually noiseless. And you can see the half a second shutter speed has blurred out the motion of the plane just a little bit. So again, here is the high ISO image, and here's the low ISO image. And sort of cycling through the high ISO image, keep an eye in this area here and see what happens to the distribution of the noise as we sort of change back and forth. It's a little bit difficult to keep track of because it was handheld, but you can sort of tell if you keep your eye on the same area that the noise pattern, although quantitatively is the same, does change in its distribution. And we're going to use that quality, we're going to take advantage of that property of noise distribution to eventually come up with a cleaner image. So let's go back to our grid view. We're going to take the first 8 images, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, shift click, and I'm going to right click and say edit in, open as layers in Photoshop. And here we are in Photoshop, and the images are being loaded as separate layers. And here we go. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 images. The first thing we're going to do is align all the images so that there's no misregistration and we can have a nice smooth blending process. So I take the first image, shift click the last image, and then under edit, I'm going to say auto align layers. The auto setting is just fine. I leave everything else alone. Okay. This may take a few seconds depending on how powerful your computer is. Okay, you can see that the computer or the program has auto aligned all our images, and let's just double check our work. I'm going to look at this at 100%, and I'm just going to cycle through the thumbnails here to make it invisible to show you that in fact it does align very, very well. Again, are you noticing the pattern of noise that's generated? It's the quantitatively it's the same, but qualitatively and distribution wise it's a little different with each image, and we're going to again use that property to minimize the image noise. Okay, so now let's continue. We've got the first image. We select, shift click the last image, and then we're going to make it into a group by dragging into this little folder icon, and it says group 1. We're going to take that group and make it into a smart object, and we do that by going under layers and saying smart objects, convert to smart object. And again, depending on how big your files are, how many images you're layering together, how fast your processor is, this may take a little bit of time. Okay, so now our image group has been converted into a smart object, and you could tell that because of this little micro icon under the thumbnail. We're going to take that group, and the next step is awfully simple. Again, go under layer, under smart object, and choose stack mode and choose median or middle value. You'll notice the noise just disappear or dissolve away. And here we go. Here is the final image, and look how beautifully noiseless your image is without sacrificing any detail. Okay, so just to show you, I'm going to go back one step. This is before noise reduction using the median blend mode, and here it is afterwards. I'm going to save this image, and let's compare it to our image shot at ISO 125. Okay, so here is our TIFF image that was generated by blending the images. So let's take a look at this, and I'm going to compare this image with our image shot at ISO 125 by hitting the C key. So image on your left is the TIFF image, the image on your right is the one shot at ISO 125. So let's see how it looks. The shot on your left is the blended image of multiple high ISO shots, and the image on your right is the single low ISO shot. Yes, the ISO 125 image is slightly less noisy, but look how close that ISO 2000 image is now. It's hard to tell you the truth, between these two images. Maybe a touch bit more noise here in the very, very dark areas, but boy, it is really, really close. Isn't that great? I think this is a wonderful technique to get rid of noise. The question becomes, how many high ISO images do you have to blend in order to get a low ISO type of image? There's no simple answer, but typically for me it's about 5 to 8 images. It seems to give the best result. The more images you do, it's sort of a law of diminishing returns, maybe minimally more reduction in noise. I haven't really noticed it, but imagine taking all those images and trying to blend them. It just takes a lot of time and a lot of frustration, more opportunities for excessive movement and things like that. So between 5 and 8 images seem to work really well for me. Try it out and see what you think. The second question is, well, can I take multiple low ISO images, blend those together, and come up with something with even less noise? And the answer is a resounding yes. You can take multiple low ISO images and then blend those together, and you'll end up with an image with even less noise. So it's a great way of getting rid of noise. And that's all there is to it. Let's go back to our grid view, and I will leave you.
Okay, so those are at least 3 techniques that I think we can really improve your ability to capture night photography. A lot of it depends on your technique at the point of taking at the venue itself, and then going back in Photoshop or Lightroom and editing just a little bit, just learning a little bit of the editing, and now you have this great set of tools that you can use to make these compelling and clean and well exposed images. So I want to just go over one last thing, and this is this is not so much Photoshop or Lightroom, but just I think everybody has, well, people take a lot of my workshops for night photography, particularly for astrophotography. And I want to sort of dispel the myth that astrophotography is quote unquote hard to do. It actually, it's not very hard to do at all. It's very formulaic. Once you learn the formula, you tweak it a little bit in the field, and then you can come up with great imaging. What takes an average looking Milky Way shot or a night shot to a great shot is not so much the picture itself, but your attention to composition, your attention to detail, your post-processing techniques. So you really want to hone those skills in. But let me just show you one image, and this is not a video. I'm actually going to go into Lightroom and show you. So this is actual raw image of the Milky Way that I took several months ago during Milky Way season of Mount Rainier. And here's the Milky Way over here. Here's Mount Rainier, and you can actually see these little lights on the mountain. Those are actually mountain climbers going up the mountain. So, I mean, it's a decent image as a raw image, because this is how Milky Way images come out when you first take them. It's not that spectacular glowing sky and great foreground. It takes a little bit of finesse. So I think people get discouraged sometimes. They'll go out there, take a Milky Way shot, they'll look at this and they'll say, this doesn't look like the stuff that's online, because that's often been heavily processed. And in many ways, I think some of the more natural images are better. And I just want to show you a couple of things that I do to make this a little bit better. And these are very, very simple techniques that I think you can use directly in Lightroom. You don't even have to go into Photoshop for this. But let me just first go over some of the parameters for this shot. Let me go to the grid view. And so here I took a bunch of these shots, and here's like an edited version. But if you look at this, I shot this with a Sony a7 IV. So that's a, I think 30 some odd megapixel Sony camera, full frame. I used a very good lens. It's the Sony 24 millimeters f1.4. So it's great for astro. It's very, very bright. I shot that not at f4, but at f1.6. I stopped down just a little bit to get a little extra sharpness at that length. And between 1.4 and 1.6, it doesn't make a whole heck of a difference. If you look at the ISO value, it's relatively high, 1600, and that's the formula, right? You take an ultra wide angle lens or wide angle lens, you shoot it at ISO 1600 or 3200 and as close to the maximum aperture as possible. You want a manual focus to infinity, and then take some test shots. And then as long as you're focused fine, you'll get an image that sort of looks something like this. It's not really magic. And then just realize that this is not the final version. You could now take this and tweak it just a little bit. And here's some simple ways to tweak this. So under the develop menu, this is things I almost always do to my Milky Way shots. And under the tone curves, people like to work with curves, but I just like to use this area right here. So I just go and increase the highlights as much as possible, right? Not a very big difference, but the very, very bright stars become even brighter. And that's what you want. You don't care if you've blown out the tiny bright stars. Stars are meant to be blown out. They're bright, they're white. Same thing with the lights. I go a little bit higher on the lights and see how the Milky Way is really starting to pop. Nothing here, pop here. So I sort of maximize the highlights and the lights. It's already beginning to look a little better. And at this point, I go and just play around with some of the other parameters. For example, I want to increase the overall exposure of the image like that, maybe increase the contrast. And then I really like working with this clarity and dehaze tools, but selectively. And I'll show you how to do that really quick. So at this point, I can go and see what it's doing, the highlights again, right? It's getting a little, and I like that. I like the fact that the core of the Milky Way gets a little brighter like this. It decreases the contrast a little bit, but don't worry about that right now, because what really matters is the contrast at the core of the Milky Way. So at this point, the general changes I'm going to need to make are made. And how I'm just going to use a brush tool coming up here. And here's the brush tool. Basically, it's the newest version of Photoshop. Is Lightroom has changed a little. It's called masking tool. And under the masking tool, I just say brush. And then what I do here is I know I'm gonna just change this area. If you look at the brush, it's a very wide brush with a lot of feathering, because you don't want that that transition to be so abrupt. So at this point, I'm just gonna mess around with the clarity. And I just know, because so I know I'm gonna mess with clarity, little dehaze, maybe exposure just a tad, and I'm just going to go over it, just the Milky Way part, right? And like, okay, well, maybe I can work a little bit more. And because it's already selected, I can just go and mess around with these sliders, and it'll affect just the part that I brushed in, and maybe a little brighter. And at this area, this is a little bit too warm, so I often cool that part of the Milky Way, like so, and add a little bit of purple, like that. And, you know, in a few easy steps, you've gone from a bland Milky Way image to something that looks still natural, but has a little bit of pop. So here it is before we did everything. And in a few easy steps, get something that looks like this, right? Personal taste, how much further you want to take this, but I'm perfectly happy with an image like this, and this is what I typically post. So I think we covered most of the nighttime shots that you'll probably are going to be taking, and the trick is just practicing it, you know, going out there and just doing it over and over again until it becomes second nature. And before you know it, you're going to have stuff that you're going to be very, very proud of, and they'll be hanging on your walls. And, you know, that's really all I have for you. It's about 45 minutes. I wanted to leave a little bit of room for questioning if you had any. So I'm going to stop my screen share here.
Yes, get those questions in, because once he's gone, he's gone. Then you got to track him down, and you don't know how easy that's going to be. You know, I never have come across the ISO blending.
Yeah, it's not. So, you know, so in my day job, I work in radiology, and so there we deal with a lot of signal versus noise, you know, and I'm always thinking about how to optimize signal and decrease noise. And one of the techniques that they use in medical imaging is blending of multiple images to reduce noise. And this is many years ago. Camera manufacturers had this feature on a dial that said, oh, low ISO or low noise images. And so, but this is what it did. It didn't have it anyway. I don't know why they got rid of it. It took a bunch of high ISO images. In fact, that's what our smartphones do right now. So, you know, when you take a shot of somebody in the dark, it's actually taking a burst of bunch of high ISO images and then combining it to get rid of the noise. And it's even smarter than that. It's taking it's taking high ISO, low ISO. So it's choosing low ISO for the parts there's no movement in, like, you know, the background or whatever. It's using that and blending it with the high ISO images where they've taken several high ISO images, like somebody's face, you know, because maybe they're moving or whatever. So that part becomes low noise because of the high ISO blending, while the background is low noise because they've taken that at a low ISO and slightly longer exposure.
I did not know that. You know, it's funny. It's like I'll look at like iPhone pictures and I'll see burst mode. I'm like, wait, but there was no burst mode. Like it was unbeknownst to me. I'm like, I didn't realize. So that's why they do it.
Yeah, yeah. And this is the technique. You know, it's not. I mean, it really isn't rocket science. It's stuff that they'd figured out long ago. and forms of computational photography. Some camera manufacturers that do computational photography use these techniques in camera. And I'm hoping Sony eventually brings some of these techniques back. So it would be nice.
That's a Pandora's box to open, the computational photography thing, where it's like, you know what, it's good and it's bad, and it's like anything else. It all depends how you use it. But look, we're getting busier. Everyone, and you're seeing a lot of people who are not just full-time photographers. They're doing a million other things,
right?
And so everybody doesn't have the time to dedicate all day to photography. So you need these things that help out and make it quicker, easier, and everything. We do have 2 comments I want to get in here, and I do implore you guys to get your questions in. Mahesh is one of the best to do it. And Elizabeth and Bill both saying, Elizabeth said, Mahesh is one of my favorite instructors on B&H. Bill says, I'll say thanks for another great session with Mahesh. Mahesh is an amazing teacher. So they see it, Mahesh. They see it out there, that everybody knows what it is.
Well, I appreciate it. I really, it means a lot coming from the photography community. So thank you very much for that.
Definitely. Here we have Danny getting some questions in here. What is your favorite camera for night photography, and why Sony for you?
Well, I'm an ambassador, but that's not the reason. I used Sony for years and years. In fact, I'd used Sony before I became ambassador. The majority of the sensors used in modern cameras are made by Sony, whatever manufacturer camera you happen to use. And they've had this track record, and, they got into mirrorless for a long time of creating these great sensors with high dynamic range. The resolution so much I don't really care about. What I really care about as a landscape photographer is dynamic range. And I've always found Sony sensors to have a great balance of dynamic range and resolution. Even the resolution is not as important for me for the long part, because I know other techniques that can increase the resolution. And I also like the fact that they were the sort of originators of mirrorless, maybe not originators, but they sort of champion mirrorless single lens reflex types of systems. So it is lightweight. Since I hike a lot, backpack a lot, that sort of got me into the Sony atmosphere and the Sony family. And I like the fact that I have a choice of all this different glass. I think they have the most variety of glass that I can if you look back here, I don't know, back of my wall, you can see it's
you got the kind of it's hiding in there. I thought it was part of the landscape image.
And again, because I'm predominantly a landscape photographer, I ended up going with Sony mainly for the sensor.
Interesting.
And my favorite camera for doing landscape, I until just a month ago, it was the A7 IV, because I thought it was a great blend of 30 megapixel sensor, full frame, and it had the flippy screen. I love the flippy screen because I take so many shots low to the ground, portrait mode. I mean, I love the Sony A7R IV, for the resolution, but I always reached for the A7 IV because I'm getting older. I can't bend down and stay down for as long as I like to. But now I have the best of both worlds, because I just got the Sony A7R V, which has the resolution and the flippy screen.
You got the best of both worlds in there. Now, what do you use in the way? Do you use apps to track where, like where the Milky Way is going to be, where the moon's going to be? What do you use? What are some of your favorites in that?
Yeah, I mean, this could be a talk in itself. The apps that I use for photography that has nothing to do with photography. So one of my favorite apps is I used to use an app called the Photographer's Epiphemeris. It was an iOS. I don't know if it's an Android. I use iOS, but now I use PhotoPills because I think it's a little bit more intuitive. I like the different save features on there, and I use that to basically, I can say, okay, I'm going to be standing at this point. I'm going to be looking at this direction. At what time do I have to be there, such that I want the Milky Way or something in the position of sunrise, sunset. So I really like that. I also like an app called Star Walk. It's called Star Walk 2. When I'm in the field, I can just basically point my camera or my smartphone, and it'll create this virtual image of where the Milky Way is. It could be down under the horizon, and you just sort of, okay, I'm going to increase the time. Okay, as I increase the time, the Milky Way is going to be right over here. So I use that to sort of fine tune what PhotoPills tells me from when I'm at home. when I'm home, I use photo pixels like it's the general area I want to be at, general area I'm going to look at. But when I actually get to the field, I like using Star Walk to actually show me exactly where it's going to rise up, because you're right there in the field, and you could see it as sort of as a virtual reality type of image. I really love that.
Awesome. We have a question from Barbara asking, how successfully do your blending noise reduction techniques work in comparison to noise reduction software such as Topaz?
There's no comparison. It's all physics. If you use multiple images to blend, it's far better. And I use Topaz, because sometimes, I'm in a situation where things are moving and I can't take a burst of multiple high ISO images and blend them if they're moving subjects. If there are no moving subjects, hands down, on multiple burst images. And you could even do that with low ISO images, So for example, if I have a tiny sensor camera with me, a little point and shoot, and I'll take a night, and it's not quite a night shot, just a sort of a low light sunset shot, I still do the burst mode and combine it, even if it's low ISO, because that'll generate. And what software is doing is it's artificial. It's taking a lot of information away. This one is still using the information that's already there. It's not creating any false detail when you use this multi high ISO technique.
Okay. And a question from Ron asking, do you use any lens filters for light pollution with your night photography?
That's a great question. So it depends on where I'm photographing. So, a couple of months ago, I did this webinar for Nisi filters. I'm also affiliated with them, and I really like their skylight filter for night photography. It's basically, it just looks like a slightly purple tinted piece of glass, but I don't know what it is. There must be something more, because every time I use that in an area there's light pollution, I get the perfect balance of colors, something that I sometimes can't even recreate with all the tools I have in Photoshop. So if you are in an area that has some light pollution, particularly if it's like city light pollution, then yeah, I do recommend using one of those filters.
Okay. And we're going to will ourselves into one last shout out here. I'm not going to say who asked this, but he said, I have a question. Who did the videography on that video? Whoever that was.
Right. I gave him credit already.
We'll sneak one last name drop in here.
He's my videography guru.
It's great to have somebody like that. So huge thank you to Reza joining us. You guys who are out there watching have seen Reza on this channel as well.
He's awesome.
That's great how you guys work together. And it's like, you have to have somebody out there that can help you when you're creating content like that. It's like, I don't get how some people do it on their own. I don't. I could never.
Yeah.
I don't know.
It's half the battle is having the knowledge, being able to articulate it, explain it, but to be able to do that in 10-15 minutes requires a lot of editing and a lot of work in the post. So Reza is awesome at sort of blending all that together and coming up with something amazing in 5-10 minutes.
Yeah, definitely.
I'm just babbling away. He goes, okay, let's cut this part. Let's cut that part.
You think it's easy, right? Like, I'm just going to go out there and just run my mouth and talk, and then you cut. But then it's like you get into the editing.
Oh, you just see on the bloopers we have. It's like, did I say that? Let's cut that.
Video editors definitely do not get enough credit.
That's true.
People don't think about, like, you can't cut a thought off, because then it sounds like a thought is cut off. And if the inflection's off, it's a whole nother world there. But Mahesh, it's always great to have you on, always a ton of information. And you know what? It's great to learn from somebody who is so confident, because they're out there doing it and that it works. So we can take your word for it.
It's a highlight. It's a highlight for me to come and talk with you guys and I really appreciate B&H sort of giving me the platform, and Sony for giving me the platform. And even though, when we record it, we may not have a huge population, I know a lot of people watch it, because I get emails and comments constantly, for some stuff I've done like a couple of years ago. I watched that video on that. So you guys are doing so much for education and for Sony, and for people like me, who otherwise may not have a big audience to promote our work with. So thank you very much for that.
Well, look, we bring in the best. So The
and
best
me.
or the best. I don't know how I got here. So, all right, one more time, if you could just let us know where to find your work. And Elizabeth was asking for your contact information again. If anybody wanted to reach out or follow your work, where can we do so?
Well, the best way is just through my Instagram. It's Starving Photographer, just the way it sounds. And then through there, you can DM me. My website is starvingphotographer.com. You can also reach me through there. So yeah, I enjoy talking about photography, doing photography. So, and yeah, feel free to ask me any questions you may have.
Wonderful. Well, Mahesh, always a pleasure to see you, and a huge thank you to you as well. Also to our host for today's event, Sony, huge thank you to them as well. But it's all we got for now. Another rendition of the B&H virtual event space is in the books.
Great.
Catch y'all next time.
You guys, bye.
Take care.